Hello and welcome to Switch Your Money On from Hargreaves Lansdown with me, Susanna Streeter, Head of Money and Markets.
And me, Sarah Coles, Head of Personal Finance.
So we are fresh from the Easter break, aren't we, Sarah? I'm sure you, like me, have eaten our fair share of those Easter eggs, although actually, for me, it's crisps that are always my downfall. And I've just come back from France and it's truffle crisps, which are just so delicious and so tempting that I just couldn't stop.
It's the excuse to have a roast with every meal. That's my problem. But I think one of the things that's nice is to sit down with your family and have a chat about stuff in general. And I guess a lot of the things that come up when you sit down with your family, I mean, apart from, the have you done your homework and why are you leaning on the table, but those difficult conversations. So there's across the generation conversations, things like, death, bereavement and planning for later life.
Yeah, I'm sure that's been on the mind of quite a few people as well. This is Easter, particularly given the topic of life and death that Easter brings up. And these are very difficult questions. And actually, we're going to be looking at some of those in the podcast today. We're going to be looking at inheritance tax made simple, particularly, but lots of other issues around inheritance tax, and also what changes could be coming down the line, what people are worried about and what they can do in certain situations. So I'm pleased to say, to help us find our way through this maze, it can be, can't it? Helen
Absolutely.
Morrissey is here, Head of Retirement Analysis.
Yeah,
So
happy to be here to talk all things inheritance.
Thank you. And also we've got Bradley Clark, who's a financial advisor with HL, with us as well. Bradley, I'm sure these are questions that you get asked so many times.
Yeah, certainly since October and the budget changes, it's something I've talked about an awful lot.
And you can tell us more about it coming up. But of course, we have had a lot of other things going on, not least on the financial markets. How can you have missed what's been happening? I mean, I've been absolutely flat out. We all have, haven't we? Particularly in the run-up to Easter, with all of the tariff turbulence. And then, of course, it calmed down a little bit when we had President Trump rolling back from some of those most onerous tariffs and imposing another pause, a 90-day pause, but not on China, but on pretty much the rest of the world. But still, there's been a huge amount of volatility around, hasn't there? And that has implications for pensions as well, of course, doesn't it, Helen?
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen people getting quite concerned. They've looked at their pensions, they've seen that maybe they've dropped in recent weeks, and they're worried about what it is that they might need to do about that. What we've been saying to people is pensions are a long-term game. Try not to make any knee-jerk reactions. Keep calm. Carry on.
Keep calm, carry on. And you've been the voice of reassurance as well, haven't you, Sarah?
Well, yes. I mean, one of the interesting things is, I think, for people who look maybe at things like bonds as being sort of maybe a slightly less volatile kind of investment than their shares, and people who look at things like gold. So there's been changes to everything, and some of them not what we were expecting. Now, I know you've been looking into loads of this. Can you just tell us a little bit about some of those weird things?
Yes, so of course, with gold is often seen as a safe haven in times of high market volatility. And although there were expectations that it would continue to rise because of all of the uncertainty, actually straight after Liberation Day, it actually fell back, gold in price. But we've since seen it achieve fresh record highs. There has been a lot of volatility, and it's certainly shown up in gold prices, but also in the bond markets. And there is an argument to say that actually it was the bond market reaction that caused Trump to reverse course and impose that 90-day pause. Because what you saw were Treasury yields, that's US government debt, effectively the interest payable on US government debt, really shooting up because of all the uncertainty that this is causing to the US economy. And of course, if the interest that the US government has to pay to borrow goes up, that will make its financial situation more precarious. And that is thought to be one of the triggers that caused Trump to reverse course and impose this pause. Now, we don't yet know what is going to happen when this 90 days comes up. At the moment, financial markets are still volatile. They've been particularly volatile again because it seems as though President Trump has turned his attention on the Federal Reserve, the US central bank, and the way it makes policy. He wants the US central bank to cut interest rates more quickly, but actually the Chair Jerome Powell is saying, hold on, I'm not ready for that. I'm in wait and see mode mainly, and that's caused some consternation from the US administration, and that's again upset financial markets.
It's one of those weird things. You think you've reached an age where somebody calling somebody else a loser which is what Trump called Jerome Powell, that would have no effect on your life anymore. But it turns out it still has a massive effect on your life.
Yeah, I mean, it does, because it then affects, of course, if you've got all of this uncertainty in financial markets, it can affect the value of your investments. But as we keep drumming in, we've got to have a long-term horizon when you are investing. You shouldn't really be investing in the stock market if your investment horizon is 5 years or less. You've got to have a longer term horizon to help you ride out this volatility. And I think you've just got to keep your eye on the long term.
Absolutely. And I imagine, Bradley, that must be something that you're talking to people about a lot as well at the moment.
It is, yeah. Whenever you get a period of increased volatility, you get a lot of calls from clients. One of the good things of working with clients in an advisory capacity is we can prepare them for these sort of situations. So when I am working with a client at the get-go, we can do things like test out market crashes. So we can do stress tests and say, if this happened, what impact might it have on your lifestyle? So actually, when these things do happen, a lot of the clients I've worked with in the past are absolutely fine. So we do get some contact, some clients who actually had a client from an email recently saying, I know I shouldn't worry. I know you've told me don't panic and stay, but please just email me back and say I'm right, that I shouldn't panic. Just that reassurance piece. But yes, you do get increased contact, but if you've had those proper conversations with clients, then usually it's all okay.
I think it's good to know that it's not a life and death thing for people when these markets change, and which is of course an absolute handbrake turn into me saying we should talk about life and death. So we should talk about inheritance tax, which has been on, as you say, Bradley, a lot of people's minds ever since the government announced a few changes. So we'll go into those later, but I know when it comes to inheritance tax, it's quite a complicated subject and people immediately kind of switch off and don't like to think about it. So it is kind of worth running through some of those basics about inheritance tax. So, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that most people don't have to worry about inheritance tax. So you have a couple of what's known as nil rate bands, which is basically what counts most people out from having to pay any of this tax. So the first £325,000 that you give away to your family, then that's free of inheritance tax. Plus, if you give away your main home to what's known as your issue, which is a very, very weird inheritance tax way of saying basically your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren and so on, then you can give £175,000 worth of that property value to them, and that's free of tax as well. And so for a lot of people, that £500,000 is enough. It's also worth saying that if you give everything to your spouse, so anything that you pass to your spouse, that's free of inheritance tax. And if you give everything to your spouse, you're also going to be passing over your nil rate band to them, which, although it sounds very complicated the way I've randomly put all of it together, it means that the second person in a couple to die will be able to give £1 million away to their family without paying inheritance tax, which for a lot of people will definitely cover, a huge amount of their assets. So it's not necessarily something people need to be overly worried about.
Cover huge amounts of their assets and a huge amount of their worries.
Exactly. And if it doesn't cover your assets, then there are still a number of other things you can do. And it's a horrible way of putting it, but one of the things that advisors say is that it's better to give with a warm hand than with a cold hand, which is basically it's better to give money away while you're still alive. So there are a few allowances. Now, it's worth saying these allowances haven't changed for a long time, so they're not massively generous. So you can give away £3,000 a year, and you can give that away every year. If you haven't given away £3,000 last year, you can carry it forward so that this year you've got £6,000 to give away. In addition to that sort of annual allowance, there's a bunch of other different bits and pieces. So, for example, you can give wedding gifts, which is nice, weird little quirk, but you can give wedding gifts to your family. Plus, in addition to that, there are a couple of other little rules. One of them is sort of a lesser known rule that's really handy, which is known about giving gifts out of surplus income. Now, sounds complicated.
How do you define surplus income? I think that's the crux, isn't it, Helen?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, how would you define that?
Well, it includes income, so it includes what your earnings are, but it also includes income from things like pensions, income from things like investments. So there is a variety of different ways that you can make that income. Basically, it means you're not dipping into things like savings and into investments themselves in order to give money away. You also have to follow the rule it's got to be surplus income, which is basically money that you don't need in order to maintain your current standard of living. So it's kind of money that's sort of on top, the nice to haves that you can then be giving away. And in addition to that, you have to have a regular pattern of giving these gifts away. So one of the things some people will do, they might maybe pay something towards a mortgage for a family member or towards things like school fees, because they can show that they've established a sort of regular pattern of giving these gifts. So it's a really handy way of doing it. You've got to keep specific records, and HMRC, they've got stuff on their website which tells you exactly how to keep those records so you don't fall foul of that one.
Are there any other gifts at all? Any that you can pull out of the bag, Sarah?
Well, there is one thing. So it's when you give gifts outside of those amounts, and they become what's known as potentially exempt transfers. Now, it's worth knowing with inheritance tax, you always drip into the jargon super fast, but you don't have to worry actually what they're called. Basically, what it means is as soon as you've given a gift away, if you live for 7 years after that, then it drops straight out of your estate for inheritance tax purposes, and it counts as completely being given away. One of the things people will do is if they've got children in the family, they might use that to give away gifts within a junior ISA, because that way you're kind of giving it away now, it counts as you're starting that clock ticking, but also the kids won't get their hands on it until they're 18, so there's a pause in order to make sure that they're sort of adults before they make decisions about what to do with the money.
What happens though if that 7-year rule isn't met and actually the giver dies before the 7 years?
So this is an area that people don't like to think about, but it can happen. You remember me talking about those nil rate bands, so that £325,000 that you've got to give away. If your gifts fall underneath that, then all that happens is it comes back into your estate, and then it's counted as being within that first nil rate band. So it's kind of almost undone the effect of giving the gift, but it doesn't necessarily mean you'll pay tax because you've still got that nil rate band. One of the issues that can come up is if you give away more than that. So if you're in the lucky position of being able to give away more than £325,000, then you add up all those gifts that you've given during your lifetime. Now, it's really important you add them up in the order that you gave them, so chronological order. The point at which you go over that £325,000, then there's going to be inheritance tax to pay. And the real kicker is that it's paid by the person who got the gift. And that might have happened sort of, 5 years earlier. It is worth saying there is a taper that kicks in when you're in that position. So the longer it is since you gave the gift, the lower the tax rate. So you won't be paying 40% on all of it if you gave it 6.5 years ago.
Does that even include if you've given a gift in a junior ISA and a child receives that gift?
It includes any gifts that you give away within that 7 years. So it's worth knowing about. I mean, one of the issues that you get, obviously, is that somebody might get a gift and then go off and having spent that money themselves, and then they've got to find the money to cover the tax. So it's worth everybody knowing at the point at which they get a gift, actually, you've gone over that £325,000. This could be something that you need to think about.
But it's only if you go over that £350,000 threshold of gifts during your lifetime.
And if you don't live for that 7 years.
Sarah, this is all highly complex, isn't it? And of course, each individual does have to think about their own circumstances, and they're really not sure it's really worth seeking advice, isn't it? And of course, there can be changes coming on in legislation at any time. We've seen this already, haven't we? For example, during the budget, there were changes in terms of investments in AIM-listed companies as well.
Yeah, so those changes that have been announced for the future, and basically what the rules are currently is if you invest in those AIM stocks that specifically qualify for this, then after you've held them for 2 years, then at the moment, then they're free of inheritance tax. That relief is getting cut in half. So basically, you hold them for 2 years, but you will still, if you have to pay inheritance tax, it'll be 20%. So that change is sort of coming down the track, and it does affect people who've maybe thought about AIM investments as part of their portfolio, and it's definitely worth thinking about. But the really huge change has been around pensions. So we should definitely talk to Helen, because I know you've been looking at this in a lot of detail.
Oh yeah, so they very, very big changes. So the big news from last year's budget, we remember, is that from April 2027, pensions are expected to be brought into scope for inheritance tax purposes. So this has thrown a lot of people's plans into disarray because they were keeping their pensions to pass on to their family. So the current position is that pensions are not usually in scope for inheritance tax purposes. Now, added to this, if the death occurs before the age of 75, those assets can be passed on free of income tax as well. If it's after the age of 75, income tax is payable. But it is nonetheless a very, very tax efficient way of passing on assets. Now, this led to people deciding to leave their pensions untouched for as much as possible, spend down other assets so they could pass on those assets to their family in a very tax efficient way. And this is all due to change now. Now, what is important to say is that these rules are not set in stone. They could still change, but it is prompting people to revisit their plans. And I know that Bradley will tell us a little bit more about that. And I think because people are expecting that they might have an inheritance tax liability, I think what will happen is we will see more people looking to gift to their family now while they're alive rather than passing it down in their will. So it goes to what you were saying earlier, Sarah, about giving with a warm hand rather than a cold one. And I think that this is actually quite beneficial because you get to see your loved ones enjoying those gifts now. It could help them, potentially to get on the housing ladder, to go to university. But also what I think is good as well is that it allows you to see how they deal with that gift, their behaviour, how they deal with it. And that could change your own gifting behaviour.
And presumably it will also come into play when people are thinking about how to take their pension, as to whether they're going to go into something like drawdown, which gives them the opportunity to leave money to their family, or something like annuities, which obviously no ability to leave money behind, but different inheritance tax treatment.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think the whole inheritance tax treatment of pensions has been a key factor in terms of people deciding whether to go down that income drawdown versus annuity route. And I do think it will very much be the case that, for some people, if they think that their pension now could have this inheritance tax liability attached to it, that might make them potentially decide to go down the annuity route rather than income drawdown. So I do think we will see a change of behaviour there as well.
So obviously when we talk about pensions, there are a couple of things that's always really worth kind of touching on in terms of pensions. So one of the main things, obviously, you can't get hold of a pension before the age of 55, and that's due to change to age 57.
So I think the most important thing is, we don't know how long we're going to live, and the most important thing if you're looking at gifting away assets is making sure that you don't give away too much too early. You don't want to be leaving yourself, struggling later on. And I think at this point I'm going to bring in our colleague Bradley to talk about some of the issues that he's dealing with on a day-to-day. So, Bradley, welcome first and foremost.
Thank you.
Now I know that you can't give specific advice here. You're only able to talk very generally about people's circumstances and situations that you've come across, because everything depends on people's specific circumstances. But very generally, what have people been worried about?
Yeah, so I've had lots of conversations with clients since the changes in October in the budget, and one thing that comes through is that because pensions have been in the headlines and it's pensions and inheritance tax, that's what people are seeing. A lot of clients are assuming that it's the pension that they have to do something with to try and mitigate inheritance tax now that the changes are coming. But it's important to note that those changes on pensions won't be coming in for at least a couple of years. We're recording this in April 2025. The changes come in April 2027. So actually in those 2 years, you're going to get the protection from inheritance tax for those monies that are inside of a pension. So there is a danger that if you rush to do something with the pension now, such as taking out your tax-free cash and giving that away, for example, that you're actually taking money out of an environment that is free from inheritance tax, moving it into an environment where IHT would be chargeable, and that's the case for the next 2 years. So in most circumstances, there's no rush to do something with the pension, and actually what you might want to do is start looking at some of the other assets that you've got and maybe looking to do something with those rather than the pension itself.
And do people think that they need to do something sort of really big and dramatic in order to deal with inheritance tax? Presumably there are big things you can do, but also other things you can do.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and you're absolutely right. Most people come to the table to talk about inheritance tax and they say, I want to put my house in trust, or I want to give away a load of money. That's not necessarily the case, and actually with inheritance tax, when I'm talking about the sort of things that you can do, I tend to put them into two different categories. You have some things which are relatively easy to do, but will have quite a low impact on the impact of inheritance tax. And then there's a category which are much harder to do, but they're going to have a bigger impact. We've already talked about some of the easier things you can do, such as using your gifting allowances. One which I always say to clients at the get-go is spend more. If you've got money which
Enjoy yourself.
Enjoy yourselves, yeah. And if you are going to be paying an inheritance tax bill of 40%, 40p on the pound, well, every pound that you spend, you're getting a 40p saving.
This is something I tell my parents all the time, although they just love camping and they refuse to spend the money going to a really nice hotel. They still want to camp. But I think that's a kind of lifestyle thing rather than them not wanting to spend money. But I do think there's a bit of a tipping point sometimes, particularly now they're in their mid-80s.
They could get a bigger tent.
Go glamping or something.
Yeah, glamping, not not really hardcore camping.
Do people find it difficult to think about spending more? Is that kind of a barrier to people because they're worried about what's going to happen?
It absolutely is. Yeah, it's way more common than you might think. I think when you're younger, you always think, oh, I wish I had more money to spend. But actually, a lot of the clients that I work with, they've got 40 years plus of savings habits built into their mindset. So shifting from a saving mindset to a spending mindset can be quite difficult. But spending is certainly something, if you can do it and it's something which is in your remit, then absolutely you can do that. Pension contributions. I know pensions will be inside of the estate from April 27, but you've still got an opportunity to put some money into a pension. If you're not earning, the maximum you can do is 3,600 gross. But if you're married, then that's money you can get over the next couple of tax years out of your estate into a pension, although of course they will come back into your estate in a couple of years' time. And then the small gifts as well that we've mentioned. So those are some of the easier things you can do. They're going to have a relatively small impact, but if you do them on a regular basis and form a habit of doing those things, it can help over time. And then you have the bigger things. Much harder to do. This is like giving away large lump sums of money, perhaps taking out a whole of life insurance contract, maybe buying an annuity, something along those lines, or using something like a trust. Much harder to do in reality because, of course, it involves giving something up.
Yes, yeah, always hard to give things away, I find.
But that whole spending, if you spend with your family, it's that really warm hand, isn't it? Putting around your family, you're alive, you can spend, you can make it enjoyable for everybody. You're not just spending on yourself. I think that's another good idea.
I think this was touched on earlier on, the gifts out of surplus income rule. And you may have a situation where your income is absolutely fine. So you've got state pension coming in, you've got maybe final salary pension or an annuity. So your income is actually fine for your needs and you don't have any surplus income, but you might have investments. And you might have a portfolio in maybe a stocks and shares ISA, for example, that's currently invested for growth and it's there as a sort of a backup fund for the future. What you could consider doing is investing that ISA in such a way that it generates an income. That income would be generated regularly, so it would satisfy the regular approach to money coming in. And if that money is coming in as surplus to your requirements, you can then gift that income away from the ISA using the gifts out of surplus income rule. And you can use that income perhaps to buy a whole of life insurance contract, which would insure you against the liability from tax.
I mean, I've talked about how it can be difficult to force yourself to give money away. Presumably for somebody in that position who's not sure whether they'll need the money later, there are options on the table they can consider.
There are, yes. You're absolutely right that it's a major consideration that before you give a large sum of money away that you know and you can be certain that you're going to be comfortable in your own life, particularly if something such as care costs were to arise later in life. So there are certain things you can use. For example, you might be able to gift money into a trust, and that trust would give you some sort of access to the capital so that you could get that money back if you needed it later in life. It is a pretty complex area, and this is where advice really is recommended, but there are things you can consider.
But as Helen was saying a little bit earlier, it's also really important that you don't sell yourself short, as in spend too much gifting and then leave yourself short later on. So there is a tricky balance to be struck, isn't there? Certainly.
Absolutely. We don't know how long we're going to live at the end of the day, and we need to enjoy the time that we have with our families.
But also remember to have those difficult conversations, because you do need to keep talking, and there's plenty of detail to get stuck into, as we've proven during this podcast. See, we could keep talking, and you give so much advice, helpful analysis to all of your clients, don't you, Bradley? But it is a short podcast this time around, but hopefully it's really been useful for anybody trying to navigate that maze of inheritance tax.
So we're nearly finished, but there is a little, as ever, time for a very quick fact of the week. And so for this one, I've been looking through unusual wills. So I found a very weird one, and it's by Heinrich Heine, who was a German author in the 19th century. And he gave everything to his wife, Matilda, but there was one stipulation. So all three of you, I'd like you to guess. Was it that he wanted her to look after his dogs? Did he want her to remarry? Or did he want her to stop talking to her brother? What do you reckon?
Oh gosh, what trauma was there in that household?
I'm going to go look after his dog.
That's a nice one, isn't it? Yeah, the
Yes.
nice one.
I actually just think it's going to be stop talking to her brother. I think they had.
You think they
Hope
had
they
beef?
Fell out big style with Matilda's brother, and there was something fishy going on.
What do you think, Bradley?
I'm very much a dog person, so I can relate to that. I think, yeah, it would be the dog.
Well, I'm delighted to say you're all wrong. So he was determined that she would marry because he wanted one other man to be unhappy about his death. So he thought the new husband would be equally unhappy. So, charming man, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, no wonder he probably fell out with his brother as well. Her brother. Not surprising. I'm sure he did. Anyway, that's all for this week. And as usual, Sarah's fact of the week never fails to disappoint. But before we go, we should say that this was recorded on April the 22nd, 2025, and all information was correct at the time of recording.
Nothing in this podcast is personal advice, and you should seek advice if you're not sure what's right for you. Investments and any income they produce can rise and fall in value, so you could get back less than you invest. And past performance is not a guide to the future. Tax rules can change and benefits depend on individual circumstances.
We should also remember that pensions can't be accessed until at least the age of 55, soon rising to age 57. And for those who are in the need for extra information about their options at retirement, as well as financial advice, there is also an impartial guidance service called PensionWise.
So all that's left is for us to thank our guests. Helen, thank you. Bradley, thank you. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back again soon. Goodbye.
Bye bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.